Welcome to No Man's Memory, where history is not just told, but reconstructed as a chain of decisions, misunderstandings, and strategic calculations that slowly shape the modern world. In the early 19th century, the relationship between Britain and the United States was far from stable. On the surface, both nations had already separated politically after independence. But in reality, the balance between them remained fragile, uncertain, and constantly shifting. By the winter of 1861, that long-standing tension reached one of its most dangerous points. British military planners began preparing for a possible war with the United States. Around 11,000 troops were deployed to Canada, not for invasion, but for defense and rapid response. At the same time, the Royal Navy increased readiness across the Atlantic, positioning steam-powered warships in strategic locations. This was not routine preparation. In London, officials were once again discussing war scenarios involving a former colony, something that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's military planning returned to large-scale contingency thinking. But this time, the focus was not Europe. It was North America, and the opponent was no longer a weak post-colonial state. It was a rapidly growing industrial power, the United States. To understand why this situation became so dangerous, we need to go back decades earlier. After the War of 1812, neither side achieved a clear strategic victory. Instead, the result created something more unusual, a relationship defined not by peace, but by restraint. Both governments reached a similar conclusion. Another war would likely repeat the same pattern. It would be expensive, inconclusive, and politically damaging on both sides of the Atlantic. But despite this understanding, trust did not exist. For the United States, Britain still represented the dominant global naval power. The Royal Navy controlled critical trade routes, and British influence remained visible near American borders. Even after independence, the psychological memory of British pressure did not disappear. For Britain, the United States was a growing but still unpredictable power. It was expanding quickly in territory and industry, but it had not yet reached the level of a true global rival. So both sides adjusted their expectations, not toward friendship, but toward controlled distance. One of the most important reasons war did not restart was not political trust, but economic reality. The two economies slowly became connected in ways neither side could easily reverse. American raw materials, especially agricultural products, became essential for British industrial production. At the same time, British shipping networks and financial systems played a key role in supporting American trade expansion. This created a hidden dependency. Even when political tensions increased, cutting ties completely would damage both economies. That fact acted as a silent brake on escalation. Diplomacy between the two nations did not function because of friendship. It functioned because disruption had measurable cost. This created a strange situation. Rivalry existed, but it was constantly limited by practicality. By the 1820s, the United States began to shift from passive independence to active geopolitical positioning. In 1823, it introduced a major foreign policy principle known as the Monroe Doctrine. On paper, it was simple. European powers should not expand further in the Western Hemisphere. But in reality, the United States lacked the military power to enforce this rule at the time. So the doctrine was not enforcement. It was a test of how far American influence could extend without triggering confrontation. In Britain, the reaction was careful and pragmatic. Policymakers immediately recognized the imbalance in military strength. The United States could not enforce global rules at that stage. However, Britain also understood something else. Enforcing colonial expansion in the Americas was no longer strategically necessary. Trade mattered more than territory. So Britain chose not to challenge the doctrine directly. This decision created a major misunderstanding. In the United States, the lack of British resistance was seen as proof that the doctrine worked, that a rising power had successfully drawn a geopolitical boundary. In Britain, the same event was interpreted differently. It was seen as temporary tolerance, not acceptance. This difference in interpretation slowly widened over time. The United States gained confidence faster than its actual military strength justified. Britain, meanwhile, maintained a flexible stance, willing to adjust depending on future conditions. This mismatch would become important later when real-world disputes began to test these assumptions. Over the following decades, smaller regional conflicts began to reveal how this balance actually functioned. In 1833, Britain reasserted control over the Falkland Islands. The United States protested diplomatically but did not escalate. The territory was too distant and strategically minor to justify conflict. But in the Pacific, the situation was different. By the 1840s, Hawaii became increasingly important for American maritime trade routes. Control or influence in the region had growing strategic value. When Britain showed interest in the area, the United States applied diplomatic pressure. Britain eventually stepped back, not because of fear, but because the cost of confrontation outweighed the benefit. These events showed something important. Influence was not absolute. It depended on geography, importance, and timing. The most serious test of this fragile balance came during the American Civil War. This was not just an internal conflict. It had global consequences. Britain faced a severe economic dilemma. While it opposed slavery politically, its textile industry depended heavily on cotton from the southern states. This contradiction created tension inside British politics. The situation escalated dramatically during the Trent Affair, when a British vessel carrying Confederate diplomats was intercepted by the United States. For a short period, war became a real possibility. Britain prepared militarily. Troops were mobilized and naval forces were readied. But eventually, the United States released the diplomats, avoiding escalation. This moment showed how close the system was to breaking, and how quickly both sides pulled back when consequences became clear. After the Civil War, a new type of conflict emerged, not military, but legal and financial. The United States demanded compensation for British-built ships that had supported the Confederacy during the war. One of the most famous examples was the CSS Alabama, which had caused significant damage to Union shipping. Instead of escalating into conflict, both sides agreed to international arbitration. Britain eventually paid substantial compensation, avoiding further tension. This was a turning point. It showed that disputes between the two nations were now being resolved through institutions, not war. By the late 19th century, the relationship continued to shift. Britain was increasingly focused on managing its global empire and rising competition from European powers, especially Germany. The United States, meanwhile, concentrated on internal growth, industrialization, and continental expansion. In 1895, during a dispute involving Venezuela, Britain agreed to arbitration under U.S. pressure, not because it had to, but because maintaining stability with a rising industrial power mattered more than territorial disputes. This moment marked another subtle shift. American influence in the Western Hemisphere had become a structural reality. By the early 20th century, global pressure changed everything. Britain now faced a rising German naval challenge, forcing it to concentrate military power closer to home. To do that safely, it needed stability in the Atlantic, and increasingly, that stability depended on the United States. Without any formal alliance, both nations began operating in parallel. When the First World War began, this informal alignment turned into practical cooperation. By 1917, the United States entered the war not as Britain's ally in the traditional sense, but as a necessary partner in a global system that had already connected them economically and strategically. By the end of the war, something fundamental had changed. War between Britain and the United States was no longer just unlikely. It had become strategically irrational.